This is Sawyer here. I guess you want to see my face. I'm answering some questions for somebody who's, I guess, making a video. And the question is, what kind of things did the class and the group do when they weren't working? Well, you know, in many ways, we had the same kind of life anybody else has in the classroom, especially after we moved into homes, into houses. After the first 2 or 3 years that we were in the wilderness, basically outdoors, living in tents on farmland, ranch land. So, but actually, starting when we were living in the wilderness, I'd say wilderness because that's where it says in Revelation 12, He took us. Anyway, we did play a lot of games, like Yahtzee and Battleship, Stratego, and we had an electronic game at the time because we had generators that made electricity at one point. And that game was Pac-Man. It was one of the first video games. We had that. And other ones I don't really remember right now off the top of my head, but that's good enough. And in those days we had, since we didn't have jobs, we had a lot more spare time. We had more people too. We were like down to around 70 people at the time I'm talking about, down from the initial 100 that met in the wilderness after T&O called the harvest off. There was no more public meetings. So, but then when we got into houses, we still had those kind of games, and for the first few years when we weren't working jobs, we also had a lot of time, so we spent a lot of time playing games, in addition to the chores, of course, of the house, making all the food, and the laundry and all that. And T&O at that time had us divided up into what they call star clusters, and that's where like the beginning of basically the simulation of spacecraft started. And we even had uniforms at that point, which were jumpsuits, and then they made us a little color bar that identified our star cluster. I think it was red, yellow, blue, and green, I think. And I was Procyon, and because of that I had a letter and a name, a number. And so I was Procyon B as in boy. It went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F, which was interesting that it was based on a hexadecimal system, which I didn't know at that time, but I learned later when I got into computers. Now the stars, the Procyon star system were picked by T&O, and the other star systems were named Sirius, named after the dog star, the biggest star in that constellation of Orion, I believe. And then there was Fomalhaut. I don't remember what star system they were a part of. That was a part of in heaven. Then there was Altair, and And Altair Star System was the group that Tiendo were giving the task of management to. Just like in the Old Testament, they gave the task of management to, and they called them priests of the bigger group, and the Leviticans were given those jobs. Tiendo said the same kind of thing. They didn't base it on the Old Testament. At least they didn't tell us that. I don't know if they were thinking that, but they didn't say anything about it. And usually they told us stuff like that. But who knows where they got the idea from, because the reason why those records are there are for the future mission, for the students and for people to identify how the progression takes place so that they can believe in them. But anyway, in this case, they didn't tell us that it was related to the Old Testament. And but the Altair group, they met with Tiendo more often, like just to handle things that were related to the craft, the personnel, medical issues. You know, they ended up starting books where they would keep track of the instructions that Tiendo would give on how to handle a cough or a cold or hygiene or blah blah blah. And when it came down to like prescribing medicines or like over-the-counter drugs, students didn't have any choice in all that. It was all based on giving ourselves over to Tiendo for all our needs. And so they would assign a group of students to be the medical people. And that was based to some degree on people that had that experience in the world. Like Livodi was a registered nurse, so she was on the medical crew. And so when someone would report a problem, let's say they had a cold or something, they would send a note saying, I have symptoms of, I have these symptoms. They would say what their symptoms are. They wouldn't diagnose themselves. They would say the symptoms are, I have a runny nose, I have a sore throat, blah blah blah. And then they would send that note, and then if it was an emergency, they could go right up to a medical person and say something. But if it wasn't an emergency, then they would send a note and wait for coming through channels. It was very organized. He organized it like a hospital, because she was a registered nurse for many years in the Houston hospital. So then she would come along, and then two members. Everything was done in partnerships. So you'd have a check partner, so that you weren't relying solely on your own memory. Like if you were reporting the results of the conversation when the two people came to the student that was reporting the symptoms, you wanted to know. Tiendo wanted to know that they were getting an accurate report, and it's always more accurate when you got two people as a witness to one another. And that's also Old Testament based, and also Jesus based. And so that was carrying forth the same standards of how they operated and how they structured the house, what we call the spacecraft, the simulation of the spacecraft. There were no props to the simulation except for the little star names and the little tiny star, color bar that was put on our jumpsuits at the time. Anyway, so they would come to the student that was having the symptoms and ask questions, and then they would go back and report that to Tiendo, and sometimes they had procedures to handle it. If they had a procedure how to handle a headache, for instance, then they would just come back, or they would be equipped when they came to talk to the student with some Tylenol or something, and they would give the student that Tylenol, especially if they knew the student's history in that regard. And and then they would go back, and after they dispensed something, they would make a report of it, and they would actually log it in the inventory of that Tylenol. Everything was inventory, and this wasn't like, to prevent people from stealing. drugs or anything. Nothing was under lock and key in this regard. But it was basically because that's the way a ship operated. They had that kind of detail about everything they did. And there was nothing fly-by-night about T&O. There was nothing haphazard about T&O, the way they did things. There was nothing spur of the moment. There was nothing that I knew about that was exactly spontaneous, except they may have had some spontaneous things. I mean, they said things spontaneously, but they didn't plan anything spontaneously unless they did it within their own privacy, and then came to the group and said, we want to go to a movie. And then we'd all hop in cars and go to a movie. And that was another activity that we had, and we had that on a regular basis after a while, like once a week or once every 2 weeks. Sometimes it would rotate, it would go into the zoo, and then we had retreats that were basically going to a different town when T&O lived in a different town, and a group would go there, a group of 6 classmates would drive there for the weekend. They would get off from their jobs, because we had half the craft working after a while when the money ran out from the trust fund that they ended up, one of the students provided in the beginning. So we'd go on outings, then we'd have, and sometimes we'd go to a restaurant occasionally, like Olive Garden was a regular occurrence, and Pizza Hut sometimes, and nothing fancy. We generally would all get the same thing. Not generally, but it was not at first an option to get the same thing. Because T&O, even though they knew that our choices were more of a next level choice for students to choose what their older members were going to order. That would be the more that would be the choice, choosing the will of the Father, which is what the Lord's Prayer is all about. What is your will for me? So if you're with them physically, incarnate, and you're with them, then the same thing would apply. But they didn't tell us that we had to do that. Although, maybe 15 years after being with them, I learned that, but they still didn't require it of us. Like, for instance, when Doe got a short haircut, he didn't require everybody to get a short haircut. But then when students would ask him if it would be a better choice to get a short haircut, then he would have a discussion about it. He would say, well, yes, it could be, but in this case, he felt like it wasn't necessary for students to get a shorter haircut. That he didn't wear exactly the same haircut as T wore. In the sense he did, though, actually, in the beginning especially, but he wasn't saying that, like, for instance, he had to wear all the same kind of clothing T wore, and, and how that goes. So, well, maybe that covers that question.